The Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. For 10 uproarious years, it seemed America had gone to an endless party. In 1929, the party ended, suddenly, catastrophically, with the Depression. As the 30s began, the Depression became the overriding fact of life for just about every American. And the next 10 years in our nation's history would be the lean years. Running for the presidency in 1928, Herbert Hoover confidently observed that America was on the threshold of an age when poverty would be totally erased, a golden age of economic triumph. Few disputed his optimism, but a little over a year later, the United States was plunged into the worst economic disaster of its history, the Great Depression. For many, the American dream became a nightmare. The stock market crash of October 1929 marks the beginning of the lean years, but the roots of the Depression were a long time growing, and in hindsight, are quite traceable. A wave of prosperity accompanied America's triumph in World War I, but those who profited were actually a minority. Businessmen, industrialists, bankers, and entrepreneurs were the main beneficiaries of the new worldwide markets that were crying for American goods after the war. Other large segments of American society did not profit from the 1920s business boom. Farmers, for instance, actually suffered during the 20s because after the war, the rich market for American farm produce declined greatly as the people of Europe started growing their own food again. American farm production was still high. There was an oversupply of agricultural produce and a consequent lowering of food prices. Farmers began losing money, and some lost their farms. The American worker also was often in dire straits. Prosperity was slow to filter down to the average worker. Wages were low, and the union movement was stagnant. In the South, blacks and many whites continued to live lives of poverty as they had for generations. So the 20s were roaring for only a few. And for those, much of the prosperity was only an illusion. In the late 20s, a frenzy of speculation gripped the country, especially in the stock market, on Wall Street in New York. Americans from every walk of life began to invest in stocks. Stock prices soared to higher and higher levels, inflated far beyond their value. Banks and financial institutions used depositors' money to play the stock market. At that time, there was little government regulation of banks, and depositors' money was not guaranteed. More and more people bought stocks that they couldn't afford. They bought on credit, with the money being provided by banks through stockbrokers. By 1929, the market was at its peak. There seemed to be no end to the flow of wealth. Then, on October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the bubble burst. It began slowly. Investors started selling their stocks. By the end of the day, the selling fever had become contagious. Everyone was selling. Stock prices began to fall, and fall quickly. Over 13 million shares were sold. Many sellers couldn't find buyers. The value of some stocks fell hundreds of dollars in a single day. Over-speculation and overproduction were catching up with the American people. The lean years were about to begin. By Tuesday, October 29th, the market crashed. Prices sank to a shattering new low. Panicky brokers began calling credit accounts due. As they were paid, personal savings were wiped out. Banks had to pay their accounts too. And since banks had also financed credit purchases of stocks, they lost more money when debtors couldn't make good their loans from the brokers. Cash was quickly drained from the economy. The banks closed their doors when they ran out of money. Desperate depositors ran to their banks hoping to take out their cash, but many lost all their savings. The loss of cash and the lack of capital spurred on economic disaster. There simply was little money in circulation, and people had little purchasing power. Factories and mines were shut down. Businesses everywhere cut back production, and many concerns without customers were forced out of business. People were thrown out of work. The result was a vicious cycle. Unemployment meant fewer customers. A decrease in customers brought further cutbacks in production. These, in turn, resulted in more unemployment. Millions of people were now unemployed, and Americans looked to President Hoover for relief. He was confronted with two emergencies: the widespread misery of people who needed jobs, food, housing, and money, and the collapse of business and agriculture. Hoover's administration responded more actively to the second emergency by instructing the Federal Farm Board to buy up agricultural surpluses in an effort to raise farm prices, and by initiating a number of public works programs in an effort to stimulate business and provide some employment. But President Hoover believed that direct relief to those in need was a responsibility of local communities, not the federal government. Direct federal aid, he said, would undermine the respect of the persons receiving it. At a time when almost half of the American workforce was out of work, he said,
"We have seen many precious fruits of the sturdy pioneering virtues that made our country first free and then strong and now proudly in the forefront of the world. If by the grace of God we stand steadfast in our great traditions through this time of stress, we shall ensure that we and our sons and our daughters shall see these fruits increased 1,000-fold."
Many victims of the lean years rejected these appeals to national tradition. The nation experienced a crisis in its philosophy as well as its economy.
Nobody knew what had happened. The old ideals that people had been brought up to believe in just crumbled, and the leaders had no panaceas, no plans. And we were all frightened, I'll tell you that.
Fear and desperation. These were the undercurrents during the early 1930s as new sights became common on the American landscape. Bread lines began to form as the hungry and homeless queued up for free meals. Shanty towns, called Hoovervilles, were created by the millions of people taking to the roads to look futilely for work. Unable to pay for transportation, these wanderers began riding the rails, riding illegally and dangerously under boxcars or in them by the millions. One railroad alone removed over 700,000 rail riders from its trains in a single year. A railroad detective reported,
"Some instances a train would come and there would be too many riders on there for the depleted force in the yard to compete with, and you just got to the point of where you were selecting who you took."
For those who stayed home, things were just as bad. Jobs didn't exist for most, and families across the nation were forced to go on relief. But there was not enough money or resources to cope with the ever-rising tide of human misery. Even New York, the nation's richest city, could afford less than $3 per week per family. Other cities could give absolutely nothing. The era was symbolized by the army of apple sellers who took to the streets throughout the country in 1932, selling apples provided by apple producers in Washington state. But despite the hardships, life did go on, and many people, falling back on their own resources, managed to establish bearable lives. Families grew closer. Entertainment existed, especially the radio. Families and their friends would gather around the radio in the evening to listen to a host of programs: Lum and Abner, Amos and Andy, soap operas, dance music. All were welcome breaks from the chore of looking for work. Movies, too, enjoyed a burst of popularity. The most popular films were escapist, westerns, cliff-hanging serials, adventure films, cartoons,
Come along and follow me.
and, of course, Shirley Temple.
We'll join in the jamboree at the Codfish Bar.
For some, there were other options. A visit to the local speakeasy let people drown their sorrows in illegal booze provided by bootleggers and organized gangsters of the era. But escape was only temporary from the grim reality of growing poverty. Incidents of violence occurred as farmers dumped milk, declared a farmer's holiday, and blocked roads to keep farm produce from reaching the cities in efforts to raise farm prices. Labor unrest increased, and the size of the Communist Party was doubled as discontent spread among the workers. In the summer of 1932, thousands of veterans camped near the Capitol. They had gone to Washington to lobby for pension money. The House of Representatives voted in favor of the veterans, but the Senate turned them down. Many returned home, but about 2,000 remained. President Hoover sent federal troops to oust them. The attack on the bonus army was a low point during the Depression. As economic conditions in the nation worsened, Congress, at Hoover's urging, created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, to lend money to certain financial institutions and industries, and passed the Home Loan Bank Act. In adopting these measures, Congress and the President were accepting for the first time the idea that the federal government must assume some responsibility when the nation's economy becomes disordered. But these measures helped very little. As the presidential campaign of 1932 began, there was really only one important issue: the Depression. It became obvious that Hoover would lose, and that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate, would win. And win he did, on a platform calling for federal relief to the needy, direct aid to the farmers, and a broad program of public works. He called for safeguards to prevent wild speculation, fraudulent issues of stocks. He said that the forgotten man must have a new deal. Roosevelt set the tone for his administration in his inaugural address.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work.
FDR's words electrified the nation, and from Inauguration Day, a new spirit was created by the former governor of New York. Advised by a group of intellectuals, economists, politicians, and reformers called the Brain Trust, FDR soon put his ideas into action. In a 100-day period in the spring and summer of 1933, FDR introduced emergency legislation which revolutionized American society. He declared a bank holiday, closing the banks in order to keep depositors from withdrawing all cash and causing even more banks to shut their doors permanently. Starting what was later called the alphabet soup of creating new agencies, FDR quickly moved to keep his campaign promises. On the economic front, he introduced legislation to regulate bank investments, guarantee deposits, and regulate the stock market. On the home front, he introduced legislation to save homes from foreclosures, and he obtained $500 million for local relief efforts. Creating new jobs was a paramount concern. A massive program was launched, spearheaded by the PWA, the Public Works Administration. The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, was created to give jobs to hundreds of thousands of unemployed youths and to initiate much-needed programs to safeguard natural resources. The NRA, or National Recovery Act, marked a major step forward to create codes of industrial regulation and to ensure labor a fair voice in industry. In agriculture, the AAA, or Agricultural Assistance Administration, was created to support farm prices and regulate the farming industry. All these programs of the 100 Days cost money, and that meant both unbalanced budgets and new taxes. Taxes levied against the well-to-do in the form of the graduated income tax. This created a major rift in the country as many came to oppose FDR both philosophically and because they thought he was socializing America at the expense of the industrial and entrepreneurial segments. These critics pointed to the TVA project, the Tennessee Valley Authority, as proof of their claims. The TVA was designed to be a publicly owned utility to provide cheap electricity to rural households in the depressed Tennessee Valley. Roosevelt's answer to the charges of interference was already on the record.
Restoration calls, however, not for changes in ethics alone. This nation is asking for action, and action now.
And action was what America was getting. The 100 Days were a whirlwind time, a complete break with the past, a bold experiment. Enthused by FDR, the nation, by and large, found a source of hope for the first time in nearly 4 long, bitter years. But hope was one thing. Results were something else entirely. As the summer of 1933 ended, America held its breath. Would the experiments of the New Deal work? Is it possible that the American dream could once again be a reality?